mushrooms too. So it's going to become an issue of interest to many people. And a lot of people know a bit about the magic mushrooms, but may not know about the history of them. So I'll start off with some of the history of the magic mushrooms. And we know that the magic mushrooms played a long ancient role in Central America because we have artifacts like this carved mushroom stone from Highland, Guatemala, dated back to probably 800 BC or so. And there are only one or two remaining original Aztec manuscripts out. I'm gonna, I think, have to fix the Life magazine article came out. The editors called it "Seeking the Magic Mushrooms of Mexico," and the term "magic mushrooms," editors of Life magazine tacked onto the article, has stuck with us ever since. That's how magic mushroom, editors love alliteration. So that's how that happened. Now, one of the people among many who is enthralled with this story of magic mushrooms is Timothy Leary, professor at Harvard, and he, in 1961, went down to Mexico to one of the villages that Wasson had mentioned in the article, Huautla de Yemenes. No, I'm sorry, Cuernavaca, yeah. Horn of the Cow. And he bought mushrooms in the marketplace, belted them back with white rum, and had his first hallucinogenic experience. Left quite an impression on him. He came back to the U.S., initiated a series of studies with the magic mushrooms on prisoners and other people, which I'd already mentioned. And then he discovered LSD. And he went totally off the deep end, I think, and started proselytizing for the use of hallucinogens, especially LSD. And resulting in the 1960s so-called psychedelic revolution of the mid to late 60s and hippie movement and all of that. And now, I'm somewhat proud, I guess, in a way, that the first mention, which is in the volume 2 of the French 2 volumes on the hallucinogenic fungi, 1965, reported that they had found the first case of use of hallucinogenic mushrooms outside of their native area, mushrooms that had been growing outside of Mexico, in Vancouver at UBC. In 1965, it was reported that the RCMP confiscated mushrooms being used by students at UBC. And I found in some archives there a letter here from 1965, March of 65, reporting, it was a chemist who was at the University of Washington and corresponding with somebody from engineering at UBC, the Research Council, reporting on the chemical analyses of dried mushrooms that were collected on UBC campus the year before. So they grow in the autumn, so these mushrooms were collected in October of 1964. Then this letter came back in March of 65, and then it reported questions about, describes the chemical paper chromatography that was used, and how that confirmed the psilocybin in the mushrooms. And then it calls into question the identity of the mushroom collection, which was from UBC campus, sent to Michigan to Dr. A.H. Smith, the University of Michigan. So the University of Michigan collection numbers, there 2,100, 13,419 is the fungal specimen number of the sample that's in Michigan. And then that fall of 1965, the RCMP confiscated the mushrooms from the students at UBC. Not long after that, the mushrooms became more and more popular. Word spread, and by the late 60s, every autumn, when the weather cooled down and the rains began, any potential habitat, which is often cow pasture, grazing fields for cattle, would suddenly spring up with people picking little brown mushrooms. You'd see quite often people roaming around in the field. And much to the chagrin of landowners, it became enough of an issue. There are all sorts of field guides put out, just a plethora of different field guides, small selection of them shown here. And now, in 1974, psilocybin was added to the Food and Drugs Act in Canada, making it illegal. Up to that point, it hadn't been. LSD was added in '67, and then psilocybin was added in '74. And then in 1979, a woman in Haida Gwaii, Queen Charlotte Islands, got busted by the RCMP with a big drawer of dried mushrooms. And her lawyer said that that was not drug possession of the drug, which was prohibited, psilocybin, because they were just dried mushrooms. A dried mushroom is just a dried mushroom. She had no intention of possessing psilocybin. She just had some mushrooms that happened to contain psilocybin. And it was decided and supported in a appeal proceeding that this can apply. And then, so for a period of 3 years, psilocybin and psilocin-containing mushrooms were considered legal in Canada. In 1982, a man in Duncan, BC, sold a pound of dried mushrooms to a narcotics officer undercover in the local bar. And he got busted and convicted successfully because he had offered, "Hey man, do you want to buy some psilocybin mushrooms? $1,000. And the prosecution said it was very clear because he presented them as psilocybin mushrooms that he was referring to the drug contained in them. They are dried, therefore they were processed, therefore they qualify as a drug. And it's obvious because he wanted $1,000 for a pound of dried mushrooms that it was being treated as a drug."
Yeah.
So he was, and ever since then, legally in Canada, you cannot legally possess and use the mushrooms. Technically, in a de facto reality, they don't bother persecuting people for the mushrooms unless there are extenuating circumstances, or you're openly growing them and selling them willy-nilly, and I'll address some issues around that soon. So this was, when they were legal, there was a church formed, the Fane of the Psilocybe Mushroom Association, and all the people that joined the association became members of a religious organization who declared that the magic mushrooms were the sacrament of the religion, in the belief that if they were illegalized again, any member of the Fane could claim religious practice and protection under the law. I was deemed a archpope, an honorary archpope for some reason. They didn't give me a silly hat though. And this is one of the founders, and one of the founders, 3 brothers, was a gifted painter, and he tried to paint what some of the visual experiences from the mushrooms. And what's noted, first of all, is a great enhancement of color and contrast, and things seem to sparkle. People always comment on how colorful and sparkly the world seems in the initial stages. And eventually, there'll be motion in what you're looking at. You'll see motion. Quite often people report swirly patterns that emerge in a random background. And these will resolve eventually into inward vision. So if you close your eyes, you'll have a colored racing series of visions that may go through your head, which may be pleasant or not. And this, by the way, is the villa where Timothy Leary stayed in Cuernavaca in Mexico, where he did his first trip. And the artist went there on a pilgrimage to eat mushrooms in what he considered a sacred spot. And people be mushrooms, stoned on mushrooms, can do the darndest things, like laying in their back in the forest in the middle of a snowstorm for hours. And eventually you get these patterns, which now this is done with palette knife on canvas with acrylic or oil paint, by the way. Now with computer graphics, we're so used to fractal patterns that we forget that they were extremely exciting at one time. And a lot of the interest in fractal patterns are as a result of people experiencing this state of mind, because that's one of the aspects of the visual effects of the hallucinogens, true hallucinogens. Now we have a whole bunch of native mushrooms that occur here that contain psilocybin, psilocin. Here's a short list of them. These are the ones native that are found in BC. And we start off with one that was found in Astoria, Oregon, in the delta of the Columbia River, and there's driftwood in the beach grasses and the sand dunes that sprout these mushrooms. People found that they are very easy to grow, and the chips began to be spread around. They make a pure culture, inoculate wood chips with it, and then pass the wood chips around, and people would take the wood chips home and plant them. And then they'd have the mushrooms popping up. And so they've been spread around the world now. All temperate parts of the world, somebody's growing these azarescens. And they're quite beautiful mushrooms. And quite large and supposedly quite potent. There's another very potent one. Oh, stop that. Behave.
I think that thing's on mushrooms.
It is. It is totally irresponsible. So, Psilocybe baeocystis at one time was a really common weed mushroom in Vancouver area, to the point where there were pounds of them growing around the city. And they have since almost disappeared. I've only found them once since in the past couple of decades, but they are still growing around edges of urban development. So they're in the Fraser Valley and areas that are marginal to wooded areas. It appears as we totally urbanized the Vancouver area, we eliminated whatever requirements these have to grow. Plus we have landscaping techniques that have changed considerably. Bark is no longer used a lot in landscaping, and we don't allow watering in the summer. It used to be the bark was free from mills and it would be used in landscaping, so bark mulch was used all over the place. And now such things are more valuable as fuel for hothouse operations than for landscaping purposes. So, and then of course water, climate change and water shortages. Oh, stop that. How the heck did that happen? Okay, and now most of the psilocybin mushrooms are associated with human habitats, human-created habitats. One characteristic of the magic mushrooms is they stain blue when they get older, when they're damaged. This is caused by breakdown of the psilocybin psilocin through oxidization. And so people used to think that the stronger the mushroom was, the more it would stain blue. Correct in a way, but the type of mushroom that stains very dark blue will be more potent when it's fresh or when it's not blued a lot.
Yeah.
But people used to actually abuse their mushrooms, age them, trying to get them to turn as dark blue as possible. Then they'd be very disappointed or sickened when they ate them, because the blue was the product of the breakdown of the active ingredients. What you want to do is preserve them with as little blue color developing as possible. And Psilocybe cyanescens, extremely potent species, grows on wood chips, often in landscape, usually almost always in landscaped areas. It can be quite large, and this lends itself to backyard cultivation because it likes wood chips, which you can get from the city, from tree trimmings. And so people can put little wood chip paths into their raised bed garden and plant these things in, and then when the autumn comes around, they'll have little crops of these mushrooms growing in their yard. This is a great option for people who want to have access to the experience of the magic mushrooms, but don't like the legal risks involved at present. If you establish your own little backyard colony, you can have them always on hand to admire and appreciate and talk to without a lot of the legal risk. And now most of the mushrooms, magic mushrooms, are associated with human activity. There's been speculation where they come from. Baeocystus was a weed throughout Vancouver at one time, then it disappeared almost entirely. Cyanescens associated with wood chips. Azarescens grew in a estuary and driftwood in one little pocket of habitat, and then is spread around the world through human activity. And this is the base of a volcano in BC, Mount Meager volcano. And in the flood-prone river there, the Lillooet River, there are little side channels, and in the end of summer, early fall, the water is very low, these side channels drain, and in the tangled roots of the shrubs along the river, there are these little mushrooms that grow, which turned out to be Psilocybe cyanofibrillosa. And so this is an indication of what these might do in the wild when we don't notice them. They might be a fairly uncommon thing growing in a situation like this. Some logging was conducted on the Lillooet River in this area. Some of the areas where it grew were log sort yards by the river. So you can imagine that they'd be hauling logs through the sand by the river and putting them on trucks to some mill where they'd be debarked, and the bark would be sold to a landscape company who had incorporated into the soils. Perhaps the mushroom spores or mycelium gets into the batch that goes to the landscape soil place, and they generate big massive batches of landscaping soil with the mushroom in it that gets spread all over the city, and you have this explosion of magic mushrooms that lasts a few years until landscaping practices change. This is a likely scenario for how these things get around and spread.
Paul,
Yeah.
what's in it for the mushroom? I mean, the mushroom doesn't get high from psilocybin, right?
No.
Why
Just
does
has
it?
fun.
Why does it?
They tend
Why
to
is
be
it there?
small and they hide, so what they do is they hide in the grasses or whatever and lure large vertebrates to seek them out. And then they companion with big cougars and bears and things that lie in wait for the human. I don't know, I haven't been able to communicate with the mushroom to the point where they've explained that to me. But evidently it's working for them because humans are spreading them around. This is one that probably came from Europe with livestock and their fodder, grasses.
Oh, but surely they had psilocybin in them
Immature,
before they ever met a human, right?
Could be. Yeah, they could be luring monkeys in with it. Yeah, and this is very uncommon. It greatly resembles a weedy species called Stuntsea, Psilocybe stuntsea, which we have some on display, which also has a little ring on the stem. Psilocybe pelliculosa is one that does grow in woodland habitats in BC. Quite commonly. It's very low potency. It's a little brown mushroom that looks like a lot of other little brown mushrooms, including some poisonous varieties. So it's definitely not recommended that this be one that you seek out. And I found mixed populations of this and potentially toxic gallerinas. They're so close looking to each other that I could sort them into 3 piles, definitely pelliculosa, definitely gallerina, and a bigger pile where I couldn't tell which they were. So, and I'm a mushroom expert, supposedly, who specializes in little brown mushrooms. So it's not easy to identify a lot of these. And, but they can be beautiful to encounter anyway. Psilocybe semilanceata is the classic temperate magic mushroom. It grows in Europe and North America and Asia, and it's the Liberty cap that people were seeking out mostly in the 60s. And it gets its name Liberty cap from its resemblance to the symbol of the French Revolution, the women freedom with the little cap that bends off to the side, which is the Phrygian cap, which the Greeks gave to freed Phrygian slaves to mark them as freemen. And then the British named the mushroom Liberty Cap because they have this little eccentric little nipple on the top of the cap quite often that resembles a Phrygian cap. And it grows in pasture land, not right out of the dung, but it favors grazed pastures, wet corners with fine grasses, and it grows from the dead grass roots. And it used to be very popular. One time we had a show here, I gave a presentation on poisonous mushrooms. We had a poisonous and a magic mushroom display. And at the end of the show, when we were cleaning up, we found this little baggie on the floor. Somebody who had evidently seen the poisonous mushroom display and had bought these mushrooms. It turned out to be exactly 1 dried gram of Liberty Caps, which is the standard light recreational dosage for the magic mushrooms. 1 gram is usually the increments that they're sold in. So this little baggie contained exactly 1 gram, so we concluded it was a black market dosage that the person had bought.
Which one? Next, top one. Oh, Anne's not working.
I hope that means next slide.
Yeah.
Okay, good. Okay, now, there's a bit of history here. At the decline of the 60s, when everything was hippy-dippy, peace and love, etc. And then there's an infamous sort of stage where things began to deteriorate. Altamont, the festival at Altamont, where the Hells Angels had killed somebody, and there was violence beginning. The hippie movement was very welcoming of everybody, including people that were like motorcycle gangs who were starting to peddle things like heroin and methamphetamine. Hard drugs became of great concern. A lot of the hallucinogens that people were fond of began to be contaminated, or they were presented, bogus things were presented as hallucinogens. There was great concern about the possible effects of some of the stuff that was being marketed. People began to get drawn back to natural hallucinogens. The peyote cacti, magic mushrooms, etc. had great appeal. Unfortunately, people made the great error of thinking that because something is natural, it might be a gentle, mild drug. They've sort of underestimated the power of the state that the hallucinogens put you into, and they began to be looked at and regarded and treated and used in much the way that pot is, as a merely recreational thing, which led to situations where people were putting it into food and drink at parties, and it was being distributed willy-nilly with very little consideration of the possibility, very real, that some people should not have experience with hallucinogens. Some people might be borderline schizophrenic, psychotic. A lot of psychiatric conditions develop in late teen, early 20s age of people. And that happened to be the demographic that was into the counterculture, into the whole drug scene. There are many unfortunate incidents through people being dosed against their will without their knowledge or consent. And there's in situations that are not amenable to exploring an altered state, like party type scenarios. So it became a real issue, and that was a large contributor to the illegalization of the hallucinogens in the early 70s. And it's a cautionary thing I'd like to say, that if we believe people have the right to use an hallucinogen, always remember that people have the right not to use an hallucinogen. And to give a person such a substance without their knowledge and consent, full knowledge and consent, is equivalent to poisoning. And it is totally off the scale when it comes to irresponsible behavior. So I was at a party, a Halloween party in Haida Gwaii, doing research there. And a person had baked a bunch of brownies with psilocybin mushrooms in them. and he had this plate of brownies with this lid, a plate to cover them. And he'd walk up to each person at the party and say, I have some magic mushrooms in these brownies. Do you want to eat them? Here. And he'd make them read that, and he'd show them the little picture, and he'd say, magic mushrooms, you understand, these have magic mushrooms in them. I want you to repeat after me, right? And he'd have to be absolutely positive that they understood exactly that the mushrooms were in there before he'd let them take one. And they started doing that just as the community in Haida Gwaii a decade or two ago, and they haven't had a problem since. When I went there, I kept hearing stories. Everybody had a story about their cousin, their brother, their friend, old school friend, oh, the son of my doctor, there's somebody who had flipped out. And I was going, wow, they've really got an issue with this, in this community. Then I realized, oh God, they're all talking about the same person. Everybody's related up there. So it's probably all the same person that had this rough thing, but everybody's got a different relationship. Their brother, or their cousin, or their, so anyway, that's, Psilocybe stuntsii is a weed mushroom, very low potency, resembles a lot of potentially dangerous poisonous mushrooms. Very variable in color and shape. It grows often in lawns and just places where chemicals might be used, and because it's low potency, you have to eat quite a few to get an effect. Not recommended. Psilocybe subfimitaria was a species discovered about 3 blocks from here in the early 1970s by a Mexican mycologist who was showing around town, and he found these mushrooms growing on a lawn just up by Oak Ridge there, and which is now probably the house is demolished and rebuilt, so that's sort of the question. Here's a deadly mushroom that can resemble some psilocybe. This is a deadly Galerina autumnalis or cinnamomea or marginalis, and there's several of these little brown mushrooms that can kill you. They have the same poisons as the death cap mushroom, but they're not as dangerous to most people because most people aren't seeking and eating little brown mushrooms, except magic mushroom seekers. They're tiny little mushrooms that are hallucinogenic. This Canostobe cyanopus grow in wet summers during warm weather. They're tiny little things. You'd have to eat a hell of a lot of them to get a buzz, as we say. But they unfortunately are closely related to a deadly mushroom that also contains the deadly amatoxins, Canostobe phalaris and their relatives. So this is why you really, why you really want to be careful. Paniolus evoltianus is another mushroom that contains psilocybin psilocin. It grows in really new landscaping. So they're landscaping new lawns and flower beds where you get that sweet ammonia odor coming off, and at night it'll be steaming a little bit. They're really fresh, manure-rich compost that's used in especially people's brand new lawns or institutional landscaping. When your eyes water from the fumes coming off the landscaping soil, they're right for this sort of thing. And they also grow a really weathered old horse dung around stables. And Gymnopolis aeruginosus is a